and entire economies. While Washington shuts the door, another global power is opening the gates, and that is China. As the US slams harsh tariffs on African exports, the rival China is stepping in, offering a zero-tariff lifeline to the continent. On the 31st of July, President Donald Trump announced a new round of reciprocal tariffs set to take effect on the 7th of August. Several African nations are now facing the heaviest duties, just like the rest of the world. Africa, too, is adjusting to the new reality of this tariff war.
For decades, the center of world trade seemed fixed. Goods flowed east to west, wealth moved north to south, and Africa was too often treated as a supplier rather than a partner. But in the last few years, a quiet transformation has begun, one so vast that global economists now estimate it could reshape as much as $40 trillion in trade flows over the next generation. The world is waking up to a new reality. Africa is no longer on the sidelines. Africa is building the routes, the systems, and the alliances that will define global commerce in the 21st century. Across the continent, ports once built for export now serve as gateways of control. In Djibouti, Mombasa, and Durban, modern terminals connect African producers directly to Asian and Middle Eastern markets. In Lagos and Tema, new deepwater hubs handle record container volumes. And from Tangier to Cape Town, rail and digital infrastructure are weaving a single economic fabric, one designed not to serve colonial shipping maps, but to empower African logistics. When analysts talk about the $40 trillion figure, they mean the total value of trade now touched by Africa's emerging corridors: oil, gas, rare minerals, food exports, manufactured goods, and the digital services running through new fiber networks and payment systems. Every corridor, every partnership, shifts leverage a little further south. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, has united over 50 nations into the largest single market on Earth by membership. It is projected to raise intra-African trade by more than 50% within the next few years. For the first time, African businesses can move products across borders with fewer tariffs, common standards, and shared digital customs. That isn't just bureaucracy, it's independence. It means the value created in Africa stays in Africa before it reaches the rest of the world. At the same time, new alliances are amplifying that independence. The continent's major economies, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, and others, are strengthening links with BRICS, the bloc that already represents more than 30% of global GDP. Through BRICS, Africa is gaining access to financing outside Western institutions, new markets in Asia and Latin America, and technologies that support industrial growth. Each deal signed, from renewable energy projects to manufacturing zones, reduces dependence on old trade routes that once extracted wealth without reinvestment. Meanwhile, global corporations are racing to adjust. Where Western companies once dictated commodity prices, African nations are now negotiating collectively. Oil and gas contracts include local content clauses. Lithium and cobalt mining agreements demand refining inside the continent, not overseas. Governments from Zambia to Namibia are building processing plants that turn raw minerals into battery-grade materials before export. That single change, moving one step up the value chain, can multiply a nation's revenue several times over. The world's financial centers have noticed. Banks in London, New York, and Frankfurt track the same data that shipping analysts in Dubai and Singapore follow. African ports are handling more traffic, African currencies are stabilizing, and African startups are attracting billions in investment. In 2023 alone, venture funding for African tech surpassed $6 billion, and industrial foreign direct investment hit its highest level in modern history. Africa's trade networks are no longer defined by extraction, they are engines of creation. A key driver of this shift is infrastructure diplomacy. Rather than waiting for foreign powers to build roads or pipelines, African nations are co-investing through regional banks and sovereign funds. The Trans-African Highway Network, new electric rail lines from East to West Africa, and digital corridors linking Egypt to South Africa through fiber optic cables all serve one purpose: continental control of connectivity. Trade follows infrastructure, and Africa is building its own. Another transformation is happening in finance. Central banks across Africa are experimenting with digital settlement systems that allow trade in local currencies. This innovation, backed by partnerships with BRICS and the African Export-Import Bank, could save billions in transaction costs and reduce dependence on the dollar for regional trade. It's not about replacing one currency with another, it's about choice. And that choice itself changes power dynamics. In the energy sector, Africa is positioned to lead both the old and the new. Countries like Nigeria, Angola, and Algeria still supply major portions of the world's oil and gas. At the same time, nations such as Morocco, Kenya, and South Africa are becoming leaders in solar and wind. Together, they offer an energy portfolio that spans fossil fuels and renewables, giving Africa leverage in negotiations with any partner on the planet. As the world transitions to cleaner power, Africa controls many of the minerals, cobalt, manganese, and rare earths needed for batteries and turbines. That makes the continent central to the future of global industry. To Western observers, these developments have come as a surprise. For decades, forecasts underestimated Africa's demographic and economic momentum. By 2050, Africa will host nearly a quarter of the world's population, most of it young, urban, and digitally connected. With a workforce larger than China's or India's, Africa is set to become both the factory and the market of the world. What shocks outsiders is not collapse, it's acceleration. Trade data already show the direction. China-Africa commerce exceeded $280 billion in 2024. India-Africa trade passed $100 billion. The Middle East and African partners are developing new shipping routes through the Red Sea and the Gulf of Guinea that shorten delivery times to Asia. Europe's traditional dominance in African imports is declining each year, replaced by balanced partnerships based on infrastructure exchange and technology transfer. That's what taking control really means, choosing the terms of engagement. Behind every statistic are people rewriting their future. Engineers building the standard gauge railway in Kenya. Miners in the Democratic Republic of Congo refining cobalt locally. Software developers in Lagos exporting digital solutions worldwide. Farmers in Ghana and Ethiopia using regional logistics to reach new markets. Each success strengthens Africa's trade position, one contract at a time. International institutions have begun to recognize the change. The IMF and World Bank report sustained growth across sub-Saharan economies, many surpassing 5% GDP annually. Ratings agencies that once predicted instability now highlight fiscal discipline and investment potential. African currencies are integrating into regional payment systems, and cross-border stock exchanges are merging to create deeper capital markets. These are the foundations of long-term trade power. Of course, challenges remain: debt management, infrastructure gaps, and political differences among nations. But the trajectory is unmistakable. Africa's leaders are talking less about aid and more about equity, technology, and ownership. That language attracts investors, not donors. It signals maturity, not dependence. So why do headlines abroad describe shock or panic? Because for the first time in centuries, the flow of influence is reversing. Global supply chains that once depended on African resources without African participation now require African cooperation at every stage. Western economies are not collapsing. They are adapting, but the adjustment is profound. Corporations are relocating manufacturing to African free trade zones. European and American diplomats are visiting African capitals more frequently, seeking energy and logistics partnerships. The world is learning to negotiate with Africa as an equal. Economists call this a multipolar trade era. Instead of one dominant center of power, influence is distributed among many. Africa's emergence ensures that global trade is no longer one-directional but balanced, diversified, and inclusive. The $40 trillion figure represents opportunity shared across continents, not captured by one. In this context, control is not about domination. It is about participation, coordination, and ownership of destiny. Africa is defining its trade architecture. The rules, the digital platforms, the logistics hubs, and the financial instruments that carry its exports and imports. The West's role is shifting from gatekeeper to partner, and that shift is the real story of our time. As the decade advances, the next frontier will be innovation. African universities and startups are already developing technologies for blockchain-based shipping, AI-driven agriculture, and regional payment networks. These systems will further reduce dependency on external intermediaries and keep value circulating within the continent. When Africa controls its data and technology, it controls its trade narrative. Looking ahead, the global economy could benefit from this balance. A stronger Africa means new demand, new production, and new stability in global supply chains. Energy diversification lowers volatility. Shared infrastructure reduces carbon costs. And inclusive trade reduces inequality between hemispheres. In this way, Africa's rise is not a threat but a correction, a movement toward fairness. In boardrooms from Washington to Beijing, decision-makers are already recalculating their strategies. They see a continent that holds 30% of the world's mineral resources, vast arable land, and the fastest-growing digital population on Earth. They understand that to secure the future, they must work with Africa, not around it. That is why ports are expanding, why summits multiply, and why headlines speak of a new global order. It's not sudden, it's structural. The foundations have been laid for years through policy reforms, trade pacts, and regional cooperation. What seems like an overnight shift is the result of deliberate effort, resilience, and vision. The coming years will test how well this transformation endures, how nations coordinate, how infrastructure is maintained, and how young Africans are empowered to lead. If those pieces align, the projection of $40 trillion in connected trade could be conservative. Africa could become the decisive hub of global commerce. As the sun sets over the Atlantic and rises over the Indian Ocean, the same trade winds that once carried ships of exploitation now carry vessels of partnership. Containers filled with African-made goods cross the seas, digital transactions flow through African networks, and policy decisions made in Addis Ababa or Abuja ripple across the world's markets. This is not merely Africa catching up, it is Africa setting the pace. A continent once described by its challenges is now defined by its choices. And those choices, strategic, unified, and forward-looking, are shaping the architecture of a fairer global economy. In the story of modern trade, Africa has not just entered the room. It has taken its rightful seat at the table, backed by numbers, driven by people, and powered by vision. The world is not watching in fear, but in recognition. Because what we are witnessing is not chaos, it is change. And for the first time in centuries, that change carries an unmistakable message. Africa controls its future.